Now, without any further ado, I will introduce someone who probably for most of you is very familiar, but it is a real joy to introduce the Very Reverend James Turrell, who was appointed Vice Provost and Dean of the School of Theology in July of 2020. And Dean Turrell studied history as an undergraduate at Yale before further pursuing a Master's of Divinity there, and he was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Bethlehem in Pennsylvania in 1996. After some years of parish work, he studied history at Vanderbilt University, completing a PhD there in 2002, focused on religion in early modern Britain. Dean Turrell joined the faculty of the School of Theology in 2002, and when he teaches, which he's doing this semester and will be again in the fall, so it's a joy, I know, for our students to have him back in the classroom some. When he teaches courses on liturgy and the history of early modern England. And outside of his very busy work as the dean of the seminary and work on the volunteer fire department in Swanee and many other things, he also has served on the Episcopal Church's Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music and on the House of Bishops Theology Committee. So welcome, Dean Turrell. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to offer.
Thanks so much, Casey, and it's just a delight to be with you all. There's a number of familiar names in the attendees list, and it's wonderful to see so many friends, or at least see your names. It would be wonderful to see you all back on the mountain if you get a chance to come this way. One of the reasons to talk about the catechumenate today is that Lent is by long tradition, a season of final preparation of candidates for baptism. That's back in its origins, as the invitation to a Holy Lent in the Ash Wednesday service mentions. So as we approach the end of Lent, it's a good time to talk about the catechumenate as the ancient process of preparation for baptism that was revived in the 20th century, first in the Roman Catholic Church and then in the Episcopal Church. There's also a bit of a timeliness to this as well, in that I'm working with Bishop Jeff Lee on a project for EFM that'll be called EFM Catechumenate. We're hoping that it will be piloted in some parishes in the fall. And that project I'll tell you a little bit more about when we get to the end of the webinar today. So this is timely because of Lent, timely because of this project, and it's also timely for me because at about 12:50 Central, I'm going to have to run down the hall and go and teach a seminar on Christian initiation. We've been meeting all this semester talking about catechumenate, about baptism and confirmation and cognate rites. So, as I mentioned, Lent was a traditional season of baptismal preparation, the final preparation before baptism. Catechumenate was the most ancient, organized way that the church had for preparing these candidates. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the history of the catechumenate, a little bit about the reasons why it was revived, and a little bit about how it might function in the parish. And really that's the end goal here really is how do you apply this in the parish? We revised the catechumenate in 2015 to 2018, that triennium, and brought revised rites to the General Convention. I was on the SCLM in the period when we did that revision. It was published without any further change in the 2022 hardcover book of Occasional Services. So I'll talk a little bit about that revision process as well. And again, above all, I'll try to underscore why the catechumenate is potentially useful in a parish and why you might want to consider implementing it next year. So catechumenate's origins are in the early church. There's some debate over how long it was. It seems like the apostolic tradition attributed to Hippolytus, which, as my students know, and here I would do my my best Mike Myers, Linda Richmond character, was neither apostolic nor a tradition nor of Hippolytus. It seems like the apostolic tradition, which set 3 years as the length of the catechumenate, may have been an outlier at one end of the spectrum. There's some work by Max Johnson, a liturgical scholar at Notre Dame, who says, actually this was more like 40 days in some places. And then there are other sources that point to something maybe a bit longer than 40, but certainly well short of 3 years. Nevertheless, either way, there was an intentional and focused, significant period of time spent preparing folks for baptism. And the hallmark of that preparation was hearing the word. It was receiving instruction and also being paired with a sponsor. And the sponsor was there as a support, probably, but also, and in some ways especially, to scrutinize the behavior of the candidate for baptism. So this was really about making sure that the catechumens were walking the walk, even as they were hearing the word, and so in a sense being prepared to talk the talk of Christian life. These catechumenal structures also had mile marker rites built in along the way to the font that ritualized the process. And in the very early church, a lot of these were exorcistic. There was an idea that you needed to, in essence, drive out the evil spirits that might be with a person in order to make room for the Holy Spirit. So a lot of these rites were exorcistic. What happens is gradually these catechumenal practices disappear. It happens in a couple of stages. First, you have the growth of infant baptism. And what infant baptism does is make instruction difficult to maintain as a part of the catechumenate. And so we have some evidence in the very late patristic, very early medieval time of annual baptism at the Easter Vigil, which would have been in many places the one time of the year that you did baptisms, transposing that practice from adult baptism onto infants. So infants would be anywhere from a few days old up to about a year old. But eliminating the instruction from the preparatory period, but keeping the exorcisms. So babies would be brought and addressed by the bishop in these rites as if they were adult catechumens. So the questions would be asked, exorcisms would be given, but any meaningful instruction is long gone. And then we have a shift towards taking the practice of emergency baptism or clinical baptism and making that the norm for everyone. So in place of annual baptism at the Easter Vigil, perhaps of infants, you instead have the baptism as soon as possible of these infants. And at that point, even the catechumenal rites, the mile marker rites, disappear out of the practice of the church. So we go from a long process of preparation designed for adult candidates for baptism to that set of practices being applied to infants to then that set of practices disappearing. And really, from that point, catechumenate is largely forgotten. The ceremonial bits of catechumenate are retained in the medieval baptism rite in a couple of places where they will give salt in exorcism or otherwise drive Satan out of the baby before the emergency baptism that's now become non-emergency, but still a stripped down, very quick, not really public rite. It's a bit like the human tailbone. There's nothing much left of catechumenate at all. Catechumenate is then revived in the 20th century. It's revived in post-war France in university chaplaincies, of all places, for adult converts. The experience of the church after World War II was of folks who had grown up in a secular society who came to the church interested in learning about the faith, and the chaplains and missionaries had to come up with some sort of process to Christianize these adults. Where for years the assumption had been if you were going to be a Christian, you were made a Christian at infant baptism and then raised within the church. These were folks who'd been raised outside of the church and now were coming in. So they looked back into the early history of the church, the pre-Constantinian church, and appropriate catechumenate as this means of Christianizing these adult converts. This is really sort of local experimentation, local practice. And then the Roman Catholic Church, post-Vatican II, in the post-conciliar liturgical reforms, turned to the catechumenate and incorporated into the official rites of the church in the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults, or RCIA to its friends, which comes out in the typical edition, the sort of prototype, in 1972. And then each National Conference of Bishops will get a translation and render their own sort of application of that prototype. So RCIA comes out in 1972. The thing about 20th century liturgical reform, as my former students know, lots of folks were talking across denominational lines over the course of the 20th century in the liturgical movement. And so what was undertaken by the Roman Catholics in liturgical reform also was manifested then in mainline Protestantism. So you find in Methodists, in Lutheran circles, and in Episcopal circles, folks who are looking as well at pre-Constantinian forms of initiation as a way to respond to what they understood as a post-Christian society in many respects. And so the Episcopal Church in 1979, in the first edition of the Book of Occasional Services, produces a catechumenate. And then in 1988, in a second edition, they produce a parallel set of catechumenal rites, not the catechumenate per se, but catechumenate-ish, a set of rites to prepare folks for confirmation, reception, or reaffirmation of baptism. The BOS rites in the catechumenate itself are fairly close to the RCIA model. The rites in the section for renewers is a little bit different. And the rites there are, perhaps show some shortcomings in those very early original versions. What they did was they looked back at a right for the restoration of penitence to Eucharistic fellowship that existed in the early church. And they appropriated that for folks approaching confirmation, reception, or reaffirmation. The challenge there, of course, is that these are folks who are baptized, so they're not true catechumens, unbaptized persons. You do want to differentiate between your unbaptized and your baptized in both how they interact in the liturgy on Sunday, and then in what you say about them in the rites and what they say about themselves in the mile marker rites. But then you don't want to imply that someone is necessarily so sinful that they've been excluded from Eucharistic fellowship when all they are is perhaps a 15-year-old preparing for confirmation. We undertook a revision of that in the 2015 to 2018 triennium. And so what we ended up doing was go back, look at the original catechumenal rites, or catechumenate rites, I should say, and make some gentle adjustments to that language to distinguish true catechumens, the unbaptized, from renewers, people preparing for confirmation, reception, and reaffirmation. We also, in that revision, tried to take out some of the how-to material on the logic that the Book of Occasional Services is really designed as a worship book. It is designed to contain the um, uh, the rites themselves, the rubrics and directions for the mile marker rites themselves that punctuate the catechumenate. But it's not meant to be a curriculum or an extensive how-to guide for how to do the catechumenate. So we made that set of shifts. And then we also tried to make the sequence of rites for renewers parallel in time to the sequence for true catechumens. What the original 1988 through really the BOS 2003, which was the last revision before 2018, what that set of editions had done was time the mile marker rights for renewers to Ash Wednesday and Maundy Thursday, where for most folks who would be going through the rites, the true catechumens, they were timed to, and I'm going to try to put up the slide here, forgive me. They were timed instead to first Sunday of Advent and first Sunday of Lent, right? And forgive me because I'm fighting with I'm fighting with PowerPoint here, so we're just going to stay in the slides for a little bit. So this is the basic cycle that we have in both the rites for true catechumens, for those going to baptism, and for renewers, folks who will be making a public reaffirmation of their faith in Eastertide. The structure is built around the church year. You are beginning the process of exploration in the inquiry period, which starts in September. What we did was map the catechumenal cycle to the program year in the church, which roughly follows the school year. Most parishes are not undertaking a lot of heavy lifting programmatically in July. And so you start an inquiry period in September. This is what in the Roman Catholic RCIA was referred to as the evangelism period. But this is basically a period to welcome those who are seekers, who want to learn more about the Christian faith in the case of catechumens, or who want to explore the process of renewing that faith if they are seeking confirmation, reception, or reaffirmation. At Advent 1, we expect that folks will have been able to decide whether they want to move deeper or not. And so you have an admission of catechumens on the first Sunday of Advent and an admission of candidates for renewal rites at that same Sunday. And what we did in BOS 2018 and carried through in 2022 was provide directions for how you can combine the mile marker rights if you have candidates for both sets of rights, for baptism and for confirmation slash reaffirmation slash reception. That next period is the true catechumenate in the parlance of RCIA. It's a period of exploration. We also, in the BOS, tried to, while keeping the main title of catechumenate, tried to take the names for the stages and sort of demystify them a little bit. Juan Oliver, the former custodian of the prayer book and a wonderful scholar of the liturgy, likes to point out that the holy mysteries are not about mystification. It's not about confusing people. So we do tend to come up with elaborate names for things. We tried to simplify the naming in the BOS revision in 2018 that carried through to 2022. So then you're in a period of exploration, and that's where you're beginning intentional preparation for those rites of initiation that will come at the end of the process. And then there's another mile marker rite at the first Sunday of Lent, and that's when you're going to be enrolled as a candidate for baptism or enrolled as a candidate for one of the renewal rites. And then that period that follows is intended to be really a period of spiritual preparation rather than didactic preparation. So learning happens in the period between Advent 1 and Lent 1, and then spiritual preparation and perhaps learning about prayer, learning about spiritual formation happens in the period of the 40 days of Lent. And so that rolls from Lent 1 through until the Easter Vigil, when it's imagined that if you have a bishop present, you can have baptism, confirmation, and the renewal of vows and reception and reaffirmation happening there. If you don't, if you have only a mere presbyter like like me and many of the folks on the call, then you would have baptism, and the candidates who are renewers might then be brought to the bishop for confirmation at some point over the great 50 days of Easter, ideally. That period of the 50 days of Easter from the Easter Vigil until the day of Pentecost is meant to be a period of reflection and reflection on the sacraments in particular, which for those who were adult candidates for baptism, this is the first period where they are participating in the Eucharist. And so the model in Catechumenate is do then reflect. So it's reflection upon experience as opposed to learn a lot beforehand and then go do the thing. It's do the thing and then reflect on what that was like. And so this is a period where the newly baptized reflect on the sacraments, and it can be a period if you are combining your renewers and your true catechumens in the same group. It can be a period where the folks who have renewed their rites might reflect on that experience of renewing their baptismal promises, but also can engage in some focused thinking and reflection on the sacraments as well. On the chart, the way that we imagine it, you then, when you get to Pentecost, you're done with the catechumenate for that program year, and so the period that follows until the program year ramps up again in September would be a period where you might then go out and bring in new folks who would be interested in learning more about Jesus and more about baptism, or folks who might be ready to deepen their faith commitment through a public and solemn reaffirmation of their baptismal promises. It's also a period to recruit folks for the process. One of the things about the catechumenate is that it can be labor intensive, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One premise that catechumenate is built on is that baptism is the focus. So anything that you do with renewers, you want to make sure that you do not displace the true catechumens from the sort of spotlight in the catechumenal processes. But you might decide you need to combine your renewers and your true catechumens in a single small group, or if you have multiple folks in the single plenary, that then you send folks out into small groups to reflect together. On the logic that it takes a certain critical mass of effort on the part of the leadership of the church, and also that it helps to have folks accompanying each other on this journey together. For most parishes, you will not have enough true catechumens to build a group of 8 to 10 candidates for adult baptism. And so for most of us, we'll have renewers and baptismal candidates in the same process. Another principle at work in the catechumenate is the idea that these mile marker rites, the admission as a catechumen, the enrollment as a candidate, are important to the process. And that's so for a couple of reasons. First, it allows folks to make smaller commitments at appropriate stages in increments, really, before they reach the point of making the big promises at the font. And in part, this is taking seriously the gravity of baptismal promises. We invite folks to commit to a process of learning and exploration and formation. And then we invite folks to say that they intend to seek baptism 40 days or you know, through the Lenten season hence. And then we finally reach the point of asking them to commit and make the baptismal promises. There is a logic in social psychology, a finding in social psychology, that says that public promises are harder to back out of. When you promise something in front of other people, you're much more likely to stick to it. And so asking folks to promise to engage in a process of preparation makes it more likely that they'll actually show up week by week for your catechumenal sessions. That's not about manipulation so much as asking folks to take preparation seriously. The other element in social psychology is that small promises pave the way for bigger ones. That when you ask people to make incremental commitments, it's easier for them to get their heads around than if you ask them just to make a single big commitment. So there are ways in which social psychology supports the ancient premise of the catechumenate, which is that it's formation in stages, to steal a line from Aidan Kavanaugh. One of the other things to note as we think about catechumenate and as you think about whether you might want to use this in your parish is what its reason for being is. Catechumenate is really all about baptismal preparation. Baptism is the focus. It's not about relationships with each other, nor is it a place to explore one's own spirituality, beliefs, and values, even though both of those things will happen, right? You form deep bonds with the folks who are going through catechumenate with you, whether you are a catechumen or a sponsor or a catechist, someone leading the groups. But those are both a means for the formation that happens and a happy side effect of the experience. But baptismal preparation is the telos, the end, the goal. Catechumenate is really about hearing the Christian message and seeing how the gospel proclamation resonates in our own lives. And so you share out of your experience, but what you're doing is talking about how what we find in Scripture and what the church teaches finds purchase or resonance in our own lives. All of which I suppose is a way of saying that community is a means, but not the focus. And some of us will have been in catechumenate groups over the years, perhaps, where it comes to start to resemble the sort of reunion groups or ultreas that you might find after Curcio in places that do Curcio, where it's fellowship and it's Christians bonding with each other and supporting each other. But this is all geared towards that endpoint of the initiatory rites. Or rather, beyond or through that endpoint to the ultimate goal, which is relationship with the Christ who is the way, the truth, and life itself. Um, Another thing that undergirds catechumenate is the premise that delayed gratification is a positive good, right? That in fact, longing is something to cultivate and to build upon. Um, there are parts of our culture, and I mean our secular culture, not our church culture, although I'll let you draw your own conclusions. There are parts of our culture where that message of delay, of preparation, of building anticipation, of building longing will seem profoundly out of touch and countercultural to where 21st century North American society is. Um, I would just say that is that's something to hold on to rather than to minimize. Um, in the conversation about open table, or rather communion without baptism, in the Episcopal Church back when Catherine Jefferts Schori was presiding bishop, she said she would much rather talk about open baptism than open table. Um, and on the one hand, as someone who believes that there's a sacramental grammar to the 1979 prayer book that says baptism is the sort of entry point into a relationship that is then nurtured in the sacraments of the or sacrament of the Eucharist. Um, you know, uh, amen to the desire to place baptism first before Eucharist. But baptism itself requires some sort of preparation, at the very least, so that uh, you are engaged in informed consent when you make these life-changing promises. So, we're talking about something that um, properly, I think, demands formation, demands time, demands preparation, and that's ultimately countercultural. The other thing to note is that catechumenate in parish life is fairly resource intensive, and it can actually demand more than you might anticipate when you first launch it in your parish. There's the obvious demands on the time of the clergy and of the lay leaders who are recruited to lead the process. Um, but more than that, it will also begin to shape the rest of parish life. Tom Ward, who was rector at Christ Church in Nashville before he came to be chaplain here at the university, was fond of saying that catechumenate will take over parish life. It becomes the thing that establishes the rhythm for everything else. Because it's a process of baptismal formation that then will bring new people into the church and then ideally connect them with the aspects of church life in that mystagogia period, that period of reflection after baptism or after renewal rites, um, where you are constantly drawing folks in and then feeding them into the rest of the parish's um, programmatic life and life cycle. Um, if you do it correctly with those mile marker rites, it also draws the entire congregation into the journey that these baptismal candidates and renewers are on. Um, it will make even folks who were baptized as infants reflect on their own baptisms in a healthy way. You cannot take baptism for granted in a congregation that's doing the catechumenate. Um, Enough of the sort of principles there. Let me tell you a little bit about the EFM project, and then I see we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to engage with those. Um, what we're doing in EFM is trying to put together resources that you can use for catechumenal sessions that'll be aimed at each of those phases of the catechumenal cycle that we talked about. First, that period of inquiry, then that period of preparation, and finally that final period in the run-up to Easter or Eastertide. So we're going to provide some readings that folks might look at before they come into a catechumenate session, some seed questions that the catechists, the small group leaders, might use as they gather with catechumens and with renewers. And then also in parallel, a set of how-to resources so that folks who are interested in perhaps doing the catechumenate in their parish, but they've never seen it done or participated in it before, they would have some materials that would be a sort of how-to guide. One of the things that's basic to the catechumenate and really distinguishes it from other sorts of resources out there like Alpha or like Confirm Not Conform, it's designed to be home cooked. And so the folks who were uh, catechumenate pioneers were really reluctant to put much down in paper. And there was sort of rhetoric that really the catechumenate has as its curriculum the Sunday lectionary. Um, and that's true, and probably also folks need a little bit more if they are truly coming in cold and have never experienced the church before. Or if they're renewers, they may have heard the lessons from the lectionary cycle that come up every 3 years, but there may be some other grounding that they need in the Christian tradition. So our goal is to provide some resources that folks can use or can riff on or adapt or otherwise use as a launch point for their own reflection as they decide what they want to do in the instructional sessions themselves. Um, in any case, what we're hoping is that this material, these session materials, session resources, and then the how-to resources will be available for some parishes to pilot starting in the fall. And then based on the piloting, we'll fold feedback into the process, improve the materials, improve the resources, and then launch on a wider scale sometime after that. So I see, Casey, some questions. Do you want to ask them, and then I'll try to respond?
Sure. I think you were beginning to respond sort of to the first one, but this person mentions that you said the Book of Occasional Services is not a how-to guide. You were just talking about this a little bit and the EFM project, but in the intermediate time until the EFM program launches, do you have any curriculum structure recommendations that you could provide for folks who are looking to do this sooner rather than later?
Yeah. So one of the resources that actually works well, not so much in terms of telling you what the specific content needs to be, but in thinking of what are the sort of developmental mile markers as a Christian, for lack of a better term, that you might want before someone moves through each successive stage. There's little hints in the Book of Occasional Services if you look at what the promises are, what we're asking folks to commit to in terms of preparation. As with many things, the Romans go in for much greater length, and so this is the old RCIA. There's a third edition that's out now called the Order of Christian Initiation of Adults. So OCIA is out now. But either the old RCIA or the new OCIA will have some points along the way where they talk about what the expectations are of folks who are going to be admitted as catechumens, and what folks who are going to be enrolled as candidates might need as as they approach those mile marker rites. So you can sort of in a sense backwards engineer based on the commitments at each of those stages, looking first at BOS and then filling in the blanks using the Roman materials. But we will hopefully have something out and available on a larger stage or larger scale rather soon.
Great. Two questions sort of related around confirmation. The first says, given that confirmation is commonly tied to a bishop's visitation September for this particular person's parish, would you conceive of a diocesan-wide confirmation day during the 50 days of Easter in order to regularize this schedule?
And this is my friend Mark Hunter, who is a deacon in the Diocese of Tennessee, who knew me when I was a very wet behind the ears priest working in Clarksville, filling in when I was doing my PhD at Vanderbilt. So, hey, Mark, good to see you. I think one of the challenges is that we in the Episcopal Church have hung on to small e Episcopal confirmation, where if you have um, uh, uh, folks in really any other denomination, it is not necessarily so that the bishop does the confirmation in the Roman Catholic Church, and certainly in other denominations, the bishop, if even if they have bishops, is not doing confirming. Even in the Roman Catholic Church, in RCIA, if the bishop is not present, it's the local parish pastor who does confirmation in the course of water bath, hand laying and anointing, and first Eucharist in that unified rite. What we did in '79 was have a unified rite of water bath, hand laying, optional anointing, first Eucharist. And then we brought confirmation back from the dead, and added it into the book for political reasons that I won't bore you all with. But we now have the normative expectation that folks will go through, that Lazarus-like confirmation rite, or zombie-like confirmation rite, depending on what your feelings about confirmation are, with the bishop involved. So, and in the Roman Catholic Church, the bishop can issue a faculty to a presbyter to confirm. What I would suggest is either we need diocese by diocese bishops to look at the sort of map of parishes where the catechumenate is happening, right? Because it likely won't happen in every place. Not every parish is going to be able to make the commitment or have the interest on the part of the leadership to make the commitment. But a bishop might reasonably look at the map and say, okay, I've got 6 parishes that are doing the catechumenate. I will be sure to visit them in Eastertide, and folks that are not doing the catechumenate, I'll visit at some other season. That would, to me, would be one reasonable way of doing it. The other is what Mark points towards, which is regional confirmations or a single diocesan confirmation. And I think that would also be a very legitimate solution. As long as we hold on to the small e Episcopal monopoly in confirmation, and don't allow presbyters to confirm, we have to, sort of find one of these sorts of workarounds. Um, Now, the other option is to say, what we will do is have, and this is for places where you have, in a sense, an immovable calendar and an immovable bishop. Um, what we will do is have the folks who are renewers go through the cycle of the church year. At the Easter Vigil, we will have them come forward and be welcomed up in front of the congregation as a whole, at the point where the entire congregation renews the baptismal covenant, and say, they will now, publicly join in a, visible way in reaffirming their baptismal covenant as a sort of capstone for this process that they've been going through. And that works within the frame of the liturgy. It doesn't violate any rubrics or change any of our theology or sacramental practice around confirmation, but it's a way of having them publicly ritualize this in front of others.
Great. Lee asks, if possible, can you address the importance of confirmation as a vital sacrament of lifelong formation? I may be biased. Pushback is welcome.
Okay. So the thing about confirmation is what it is fundamentally is a public reaffirmation of your baptismal promises in front of the bishop. And you can, in other denominations, take out the in front of the bishop part, right? But for us, it's a public reaffirmation of baptismal promises in front of the bishop with the laying on of the bishop's hands. Fundamentally, we've defined it as a pastoral rite, so it's not published next to baptism in the rite. When we talk about the rite, liturgical theologians and liturgical scholars will tend to speak of it as, again, this sort of pastoral act of a public reaffirmation of promises. Um, so it's important, but it's important for anthropological reasons, for reasons having to do with us humans, as opposed to it being something where some kind of grace is conferred that was not there already. So it's not a it's not a rite of initiation anymore, although we'll sometimes speak of it as part of the complex of rites of initiation because of its origins, which are back in a unified baptismal rite, where basically, much like an iceberg breaking off the ice shelf in Antarctica, a final anointing and handling broke free and floated off. So the sort of iceberg image of this thing that floated free explains why we speak of it as initiatory, but the iceberg really is not part of the ice shelf anymore. We just know where it came from. So confirmation is not really initiatory anymore. It doesn't bring someone into some sort of status that they were not in prior. What it does is it allows folks to make these public promises and commit to them with witnesses. So it's important in that sense, but it's not necessary to salvation. It's arguably not especially critical from a formational standpoint for someone who was baptized as an adult, right? And has made those public promises with witnesses as a conscious, willing participant.
Great. I'm going to jump because I think this is a easy one.
Uh-huh.
Could you clarify whether an adult catechumen is taking the Eucharist during the cycle of the catechumenate, or does that occur during the reflection period?
Okay, so yeah, uh, a catechumen, properly so called, is by definition unbaptized, and in the Episcopal Church, the unbaptized are not supposed to receive communion. This is back to what I mentioned about the sacramental grammar of the 1979 prayer book, and indeed of Christianity, East and West, from origins, or at least from the time of the Didache, in very early days, hinge of the early second century, up to the present. So a catechumen would not be receiving the Eucharist, and indeed, one of the options that you see in the mile marker rites along the way in the BOS and in RCIA/OCIA is you might actually send the catechumens forth with a special blessing before the Eucharist so that they can study and not be there as sort of spectators, watching other folks get to do something that they can't do yet. But yeah, so they would be receiving the Eucharist only in that mystagogy period, or that period of reflection.
Perfect. Um, can you speak to the countercultural challenge, even within the culture of the Episcopal Church, that a catechumenate presents to average Sunday attendance? And in parentheses, our need to chase numbers in success of parish life.
And this is Matt Wise, also a former student. Hey, Matt, so good to see you. So one of the things about the catechumenate is that it's really uh, about going deeper, about meaningful preparation. We might think of it as in the way that people who look at churches speak about high demand versus low demand, right? Or high ask versus low ask. When you're thinking about church membership, catechumenate is a sort of high ask or high demand practice. You're asking folks to commit to something. If you're in it for the pelts, right? If you're in it for how many notches you can put on the church door, or your ASA, um, it it's probably catechumenate is probably not the solution you're looking for. Um, Paradoxically, if you want folks to stick, if you want them to develop a faith life and a practice and stay with the church, um, one of the things that we find in social psychology is that things that ask more of people, they tend to value more highly. And things that require more of a commitment, they tend to stick to longer. And so there is a paradoxical way in which it may help with we might say retention, but not necessarily with sheer numbers of folks coming through the doors initially, right? Because it's a high ask, but the folks who come in and do catechumenate are likely to stick longer. Um, I think one of the things about the church as a whole, right? We're living in this really interesting time where um, the um, the church is in many ways returning to a pre-Constantinian or a pre-Christendom model, right? The culture is certainly no longer, even now down here in the Southeast, the culture no longer actively supports joining a faith community. And there's no sort of particular social incentives for that anymore in most places. The demographics of the Episcopal Church drove a lot of the growth in the post-war era. You can map the birth rate for US born folks and the attendance figures of the Episcopal Church. And as Molly James from the National Church or International Church has pointed out, the lines move in tandem, right? And as the birth rate has fallen, so has the Episcopal Church attendance patterns. I think that provides a wonderful opportunity for us to let go, perhaps, of some of our numbers-driven anxieties and to say, we're moving into a different era. And we want to bring folks into Christian faith and life, not because we want more numbers so we can brag about our ASA or we want more money, but because we have something that's worth sharing, the gospel of Jesus Christ. If that is worth sharing, it's worth sharing well and bringing people in so that the faith that they come to know is one that takes root in them and becomes an animating force in their lives. And catechumenate provides a great way to do that. It's not the only way, but I think it's a really good way to ground folks in the gospel and then empower them to live it out in the world, and then point them towards ways that they can live deeper into it and engage in their local faith community and engage also in their ministry in the world. So, ASA is going down. ASA is going to go down because we are just captive to some demographic trends. I would rather us say, okay, that means we can let go of ASA as our determinant of whether we're being faithful and focus on being faithful. I have a suspicion that actually, if we were to bring people into an encounter with the risen Christ through the gospel and through coming into the church and engaging in the sacraments, but more importantly, also through the way we live our lives out among them in the world, I have a hunch that folks will get excited about that they will come in and that our ASA numbers will actually tick up a bit because we'll be a faithful church. I think we need to focus on being a faithful church and embrace, Matt, exactly what you're pointing to, which is this countercultural trend. Countercultural even within the church, both in the way we used to map numbers and in our current anxiety about those numbers. Embrace that, live faithfully, and remember a great line from Aidan Kavanaugh, which I love to use in liturgy classes, but I think it also applies in bigger contexts. Reverence is a virtue, not a neurosis, and God can take care of himself. Transpose that into thinking about mission, right? God can take care of himself. Our job is to be faithful. And admittedly, it's easy for me to say, not looking at ASA figures and annual parish giving, but seminaries are just a bit downstream from you all. And the trends that shape your experiences have an effect on us too. And so, this is perhaps a counsel I need to hear as well. Don't worry about the numbers, worry about being faithful.
I know we are coming up on time. There's one question asking whether you imagine the Episcopal Church moving towards presbyteral confirmation as opposed to, you've sort of alluded around that a couple of times. And then finally, if you want to mention it, this person asks about if longing, you mentioned longing, setting up the desire for Eucharist, I believe is where this context is. If longing is a good thing that we need to maintain and encourage, what would you say about dismissing the unbaptized or catechumens? And if this is important, how might we introduce this into a parish?
Yeah. So let me say first on the presbyteral confirmation, I don't see it happening. I think we had our chance in the 79 revision process. Maybe we get there because bishops finally get either so burned out or we combine dioceses sufficiently that there's no way that we can get a bishop to every parish to confirm all of the folks seeking that right. I'd be happy to be surprised. In terms of longing and the dismissal of catechumens, there's actually a set of suggestions about how to do that in the Book of Occasional Services. In the print version of 2022, it was there in the online version of 2018. So I'd get hands on the 2022 BOS. And there's a section in there. Jeff Lee tells the story when he was doing catechumenate in a parish in the Pacific Northwest, where there was a catechumen who wanted to be dismissed, and they were not sure that they were going to do that in that parish. It seemed, a little much to them, and got all of our anxieties about being welcoming to folks ratcheted up, right? But the catechumen wanted to be dismissed, and so they dismissed the catechumen with this blessing every Sunday, and the text is beautiful, and it speaks of sending the catechumen out to feast on the word, and of how we all longed to for the day when they would feast at the Eucharistic table with the rest of the fellowship. The catechumen later, in reflecting on the experience post-baptism, the now neophyte, said that she'd never felt so valued and cared for as in that experience of being blessed and sent forth, being dismissed as a catechumen. So what other people were worried about would be seen as exclusionary was actually a profound gesture of hospitality in the experience of this catechumen. With that, I need to run down the hall and talk about confirmation and the catechumenate with some MDiv students. It has been a delight to be with you all, and I'm so sorry that I have to run.
Not at all. Thank you.